would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, today I am joined with Ike Baker. Ike is somewhat of an esotericist. He's exploring the occult arts and sciences. I don't know a whole lot about you and your background. We just kind of talked briefly before I started recording, but I believe you are a Freemason as well. Is that correct? Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on your overall kind of background for the listeners as well.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure. I started out working my way through the esoteric orders of the Western esoteric tradition, believe it or not, with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Obviously, the Cicero, I guess, lineage you would call it. That was 2016. I had studied quite a bit before then, since at least 2006. I got into Western occultism, as many people have, my own generation, through Manly Palmer Hall and his works and lectures and things like that. I had no idea really what magic was. I just knew that I was very interested in the occult imagery and symbolism and aesthetic. But also, I guess there was this underlying impulse. I guess now when I explain it to people, and I think it resonates with a lot of people in the occult, or seek just in general, I felt like I had to at least try to reach out and make contact with whatever was calling out to me. And so I just kind of by happenstance found this group. I was looking for a Kabbalah study group. Kind of an interesting story. I read this book, The Oracle of Kabbalah by Rabbi Richard Seidman. Had no idea what I had just read, finished it in one day, and decided, even though I didn't really understand it, I really felt like it was important. So I reached out back when people used the yellow pages on the internet. I looked for a Kabbalah study group in my local region. Guy's phone number came up. He said, "Oh, we don't do that anymore, but there's this other thing." So I just got involved with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn on kind of a whim. Had no idea what magic was. Still went through the system. That was the only thing that I did for, I want to say, 5 years or 4 years. And then I moved to North Carolina. I'm formerly from New York. And I moved to North Carolina and got involved here with the local temple. And I became the imperator. So that's one of the temple chiefs. For anybody who's not familiar with that system, there are 3 chiefs that run every temple. And it's not like worshipful master kind of thing where they change every year. It's like once you're installed, it's kind of your job for life. And it was actually through some guys that I met down here, they really encouraged me to get involved in Freemasonry. And for the longest time, I avoided it completely because I felt like it might be kind of imbalanced, not having the male perspective. But I got introduced to a couple of the brothers at Mount Hermon Lodge 118 in Asheville, and it was just, the camaraderie was just immediate. And luckily I fell in with a bunch of guys there that are very esoterically minded, right? Because not all lodges are like that. But I also do Martinism under the I guess I'm an SI, Superior Inconnu. It's kind of like the Master Mason version of Martinism. I do that under the Martinist Order of America, and I also am a Reverend Deacon in a Gnostic church under the ACGRC, the Apostolic Church of the Golden Rose Cross.
Wow. Yeah, that's so okay. That's cool because there's so much I want to kind of reply to all of that. But I heard you discuss the kind of the female and the male aspect thing with one of your previous guests on your podcast. And I just thought it was so interesting and cool. And you guys kind of discussed that in a really interesting way. So I'll just defer anybody that's listening, if they do have kind of similar notions or curiosities about that, I would recommend that they go listen to that because that was just a great episode overall. But one thing I wanted to ask you was about, I think you said the Cicero lineage in relation to the Golden Dawn. What does that mean? I'm not familiar with that, so maybe you could kind of enlighten me a little bit on that.
Sure, sure. So are you familiar with I guess the founding iteration of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the 1880s, Sam Mathers, Win Westcott?
Not enough to even describe it. No, I'm not.
So essentially it was three high-ranking Masons. I believe they came at the SRIA, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. And so it was in England in the 1880s. And just to give like a synopsis here, because we're talking about a lot of history, they essentially created from these documents called the cipher manuscripts. The origin is debatable, but it really doesn't matter. If it works, use it. They created the system and curriculum for Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn. There's been a lot of historical research, I guess, kind of done, amateur research, or based on like where it really came from. And there's this idea that it came from this fringe lodge of German Masonry back then. It kind of originated and was brought over to England that way, but we don't really know, and I don't think we can know, and I'm not certain that that's what's important. But so it started there, as far as we know, in England in the 1880s with three Masons, William Robert Woodman, William Wynne Westcott, and Sam Little McGregor Mathers. They created this system of rituals and curriculum, and essentially it was an exploration of the entire Western esoteric tradition. They incorporated everything from contemporary writers of that time, like Eliphas Levi, and they went as far back as Agrippa. They used, Mathers translated the Key of Solomon. He translated Nora von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denuded. So they were really, really incorporating a very broad section of the Western esoteric tradition and synthesized it into what at the time was a modern, workable, initiatic system of magic. And it will, that's where the lesser ritual of the pentagram comes from. They made it up. So you've got, there's a tremendous amount of cross-pollination, right? Because you've got initiates like Gerald Gardner, who went on to found basically, Wicca. You've got Aleister Crowley, who was put through the entire Outer Order in a year, lost his mind, and basically took the Golden Dawn system and completely inverted it, but carried over a lot of, that Thelemites also used the lesser ritual of the pentagram. You've got initiates like Dion Fortune, who went and started the Fraternity of the Inner Light and spread all that stuff. So, but it all came from this nucleus of the Golden Dawn. It dissipated, it split actually in the early 1900s, and since then it's been this, like, I guess, lineage goose chase for who's got the real thing. um, my own opinion is that the egregore, whatever you want to call it, it goes where it needs to. It is retained in one area at a time and then withdraws, or it kind of, I guess, can be active in two spatially different areas as well. But the interesting thing was that one of the initiates of the early order, Dr. Robert Felkin, he brought the order to New Zealand. And there was this temple of very dedicated, very quiet adepts. It's written like Ware Ra, but I believe it's pronounced Fare Ra. And they did a tremendous amount of work. They innovated as well. Pat Zaleski, Nick Farrell, they talk a lot about it. They had the opportunity to work and talk with some of those adepts over there. But I believe that they shut their doors permanently and disposed of a lot of their records, if not all of them, in 1978. And unbeknownst to them or to Chick and Tabitha Cicero, that was the same year that Chick and Tabitha Cicero, I believe in Georgia in the United States, founded their temple, Isis Urania of the Golden Dawn. They worked closely with Israel Regardie, and he actually consecrated their vault of the Adepti, and that's this incredible ritual space where Golden Dawn adepts are made. So there are other factions. I mean, I don't believe that there's any one true lineage, but it's good to clarify, because really anybody can, and they have, picked up the Black Book and said, we're the Golden Dawn now, or, we're working this curriculum. And some of that is great. Some of that is not so great, in my opinion. So I do always like to specify that that's the school or lineage that I came up in.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was super informative. And yeah, I believe, if I'm not confused, I interviewed a guy a while back named Rubophilos Solflair out of New Zealand. I believe that he actually founded a temple out there. And I think that he did mention the Fire Ra aspect of things. So I'm not sure if there's any connection there. But yeah, I think I have heard that. So that's really interesting. But I just want to say to you and for the listeners, I came across you pretty recently, and I went and I watched your episode that you did on the theory of magic and kind of like the metaphysical mechanics behind it. And you just fucking nailed it, like, in every way. And it was just beautifully crafted and like super in depth, and a great summation of some really kind of complex and abstract concepts. But your delivery and like your descriptive style, it was like super comprehensive, and it was just pure gold. So honestly, probably one of the best that I've heard so far. And I have to compliment you on that before we kind of get into things. But I encourage everybody
Thank
to
you,
go.
man.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely recommend everybody go and listen to that. And I do want to talk about magic because it's just so fascinating. And disclaimer, like, I consider myself very uninformed and uncertain, or kind of very undereducated in a lot of these things, but that's why I kind of enjoy discussing them and talking with guys like yourself who are a lot more well versed in all of this. So like, when it comes to my thoughts personally, I mean, I guess I feel like everything is magic, and like the results or manifestations of one's individual magic, I feel like it's dependent upon maybe their levels of awareness and intention and focus. And the way I see it, it's like whether it's a morning coffee ritual to get the day going, or reading affirmations to calibrate a mental state. I guess one of the ways I could relate my experiences is like the magic of inducing like a flow state or something like that. Like, uh, I think it can be different, like for anyone, depending on maybe their mentality and biology. But I mean, give me like some piano music or some Egyptian music and a glass of wine and a canvas, and I'll make some beautiful art. Or it could work in other ways. I can go run for a mile. I can start breaking a sweat, drink a coffee, smoke a blunt, and boom, like that's like another kind of creative flow state that is kind of being induced. So maybe that's what you could call like a catalytic magical ritual or something. I don't know. I don't know if it's the same, but maybe it's in the ballpark of what would be considered magic. And I think there's lots of stuff like that, and
Yeah.
maybe environmental, like in terms of personal your environment, and like kind of creating something very like a magical environment or something. But maybe magic is like the deliberate method that one deploys in order to fulfill or achieve any particular aim. But I wonder if someone came to you, like knowing nothing about the esoteric nature of things, and they were like, "What do you mean you're interested in magic? What are you talking about? Like, how do you convey to someone some kind of understanding of the nature of magic as you've come to recognize it?" And then after that, I want to ask you the same question I heard you ask one of your recent guests: is how you experience that magic.
Right. Well, I totally get the gist of your question, and I am going to answer it. But the first thing that I want to say, because I think it's really important for just in general, is if somebody were to come to me and ask me that question, I would probably not answer it. I would probably leave and tell them to do their own research. I think one of the most important things that we can do is to uh preserve our energy and not necessarily feel like we have to give an explanation of things. That's just something I want to say because I've been back in social media doing this podcast, and everybody's an expert. So it's like one of those things where I see a lot of people wasting energy and time, and I just want to say that for whoever needs to hear that right now. You don't have to explain your viewpoint to everybody.
For sure.
But if it was somebody that if it were somebody that I kind of trusted, or got the feeling that they had a sincere interest and weren't trying to sort of bait me into defending myself, I would probably, well, I want to touch first on something you said. It magic is everything. And people will call magic, they'll give that label to something that it's not supernatural. It's actually extremely natural. It's just we don't understand how it works entirely, particularly locked into our very limited scientific reductionist, sort of reductive, skeptical paradigm that we're in right now. And it can be really hard to embrace new ideas and new perspectives based on this sort of a priori judgment that we have going on at all times. It's like a priori is basically like, I don't need to have an experience of that. I know that it can't happen because in theory it shouldn't be able to happen. But as we sort of evolve and move past this, fear of being a fool, right? Nobody wants to be a fool. That's why people tend to, they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to feel like they wasted their time. They don't want to feel like their judgment was incorrect or somehow false. in giving credence to these things, and those are all legitimate things. But as we evolve beyond where we are right now, which is kind of, I feel like we're in like a puberty. The entire human race on Earth is in some kind of puberty, right? It's very uncomfortable. There's a lot of tension. We're breaking out of something that was one way for so long. And as we evolve and our thoughts develop, I think that we will come to understand that there is extreme value in the subjective, not just in the objective, because it's safe, it's measurable, it's quantifiable. You know, one of the most liberating things I ever did for myself was learn to trust my subjective experience. Vet, but trust, or at least hold both of those things up without there needing to be one answer. Take the subjective, take the objective, and just be with them for a while. I guess a lot of people might say, well, that would cause cognitive dissonance, but again, it comes from this, you know, and I've said it in some of my presentations, it comes from this Cartesian, Aristotelian, this or that mentality. It doesn't have to be this or that. In fact, it's always this and that.
Yes.
So I would say that yeah, magic is all of those things, but I do believe in the existence of, I guess, an unseen force behind things, another side. You know, I guess I like to say that I'm a Platonic realist or a Platonic idealist. I believe in a world of forms that transcends material and informs it. It explains the intelligence and the pattern, the kind of like astral DNA of how nature is just able to constantly permutate and create new things based on these principles. There has to be something behind that.
I love that.
Yeah.
That astral DNA.
It's a blueprint. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a blueprint behind it all. But so, you know, that said, then, right, if let's use a little bit of I guess traditional logic, if P then Q, if that's true, if we accept that, and I do, then that means every physical thing has a spiritual consequence.
100%.
They're not separate. You don't toggle. It's not either spiritual or material. It's, you know, you brush your teeth, there's some kind of, as crazy as that sounds, there's some kind of spiritual consequence to that, and vice versa. And the two are always kind of informing each other. There's always this push-pull. So I think that's really important to understand. And you definitely touched on that. Like, that was the heart of what you were saying, I think, when you were talking about kind of living mundane life and creating these spaces for creativity or flow states and stuff like that. And I see a huge trend right now in the esoteric communities that they want to just look at magic like it's, you know, psychology, because that's comfortable, that's safe, right? They don't have to feel like a fool and tell people that they believe in magic and maybe be wrong. But the reality is, at least from my perspective, that yes, it is psychological, but psychology itself, being a part of the human organism, has a spiritual consequence. It has a spiritual, you know, aspect. And when you know, one of the things I think about, especially if you're into like chi theory or bioenergetics, in terms of you know, sphere of sensation, the aura, the energy body, etheric body, any of that kind of stuff. Let's say you have what they call complexes, right? It's just this trauma that you had that created this feedback loop in your psychology, in your psyche. And that feedback loop gets triggered by certain things that remind you of that trauma or the way you felt. And then it sets off this automatic process of behavior that you are 9 times, 10 times out of 10, completely unaware it's happening. So let's say you work on that, and you work through your shadow, whatever you want to call it. You work through your traumas, you address them, you integrate them. Well, from an energetic perspective, you've taken a blockage or something that was confined, or again, like the psychology we were talking about, it was on this energy that was on this feedback loop, just going in circles over and over and over, was bound up. Well, now that you've worked that out, there is more, I guess, what I would call psycho-spiritual energy that is available to you. So, and that also plays to why people are able to have these, spiritual or religious experiences when they go through something like, depth psychology, or even recovery and things like that. People get spiritual, because they have an experience of their energy, I guess, becoming freed, and thereby expanding their consciousness to levels they didn't even understand were previously possible. And that was the spiritual consequence of something material, and to me, that's really magic. Magic is study of consciousness, and we've put something very big into a very small box for a very long time. And magic is just something, it's a term we use to describe this period of rediscovery we're having. We're rediscovering what our consciousness can do, the role it plays, and all these different parts of ourselves that we have to reclaim. I think we're really feeling the pressure now to reclaim these parts of ourselves and integrate them.
Wow.
As just a whole.
Absolutely. That was beautifully said. And I definitely agree. And I like the kind of correspondence or relation that you did with kind of people into recovery, because I've been privy to, and I've had past relationships with individuals who have been in that sort of space, and it's almost like you're kind of forced to interact with this spiritual aspect because you're no longer being dependent on maybe a substance or something along those lines. So you're almost entering into this whole new awareness of just more of a spiritual nature. So I have seen that firsthand, and I think that that's just spot on. That was a really good like analogy. And yeah, so kind of like on the subject of that, like with magic, because there's different, I mean, it encompasses obviously so much, like we just kind of went over, but in a larger sense of things, there's a lot of people that discuss, say, like theurgy or sorcery, and those are some. That's what I wanted to ask you, and your personal. I'm curious. Like, do you make a distinction between, say, things like theurgy and things like sorcery? And obviously, these are words, and they can get, over time, they can kind of gain an egregore of their own. But I'm curious, as far as you're concerned and your experience and your knowledge, how do you distinguish between the two, or do you, and anything you kind of have in regard to that?
Yeah. I mean, I like words. I like distinctions. I enjoy labels because they help us to have a dialogue about things and to communicate our perspectives. So I don't necessarily, it's not that I don't believe that words aren't arbitrary, but I find that viewpoint to be completely useless. You can't have a conversation about anything until you define your terms. So for me, yes, I'm big on that. And the number one distinction I make is intent. Because at the end of the day, all we're talking about is consciousness. So if I take a gun and shoot somebody, it can either be murder or it can be self-defense. It depends on the context. It depends on, the intent. So for me, sorcery is I want to serve myself, and I want to experience a taste of personal power. And I want to, I guess, exalt that aspect of myself which wants to have control over things. And theurgy, to me, having studied through and through and through the source of theurgy, the Neoplatonic. I'm not just using this because I pulled it off the internet. Like, I've read on the mysteries by Iamblichus twice, and so you know I'm going based off of what was discussed in those works, what the creators of theurgy, or at least the popularizers of it, thought theurgy was. Okay, so that for me is transcending all those things I just said, transcending what I want to have happen, and attempting to sync myself up with that which is higher than me. And the interesting thing about theurgy is that, so Plotinus was a Neoplatonist. He was, I guess, academically, the party line at this point is that Plotinus was the first Neoplatonist. You're right, because Neoplatonism is just a term for the late Platonists of the Hellenistic world in the beginning of, the Common Era. And his whole thing was like very, very mystical, almost Buddhist. I guess the argument really was, for him, the soul is not descended into the body. That was his argument. The soul is in another realm. So whatever this is, I have to abnegate it. I have to ignore its pull here. It was very ascetic, is a great word for that. Whereas you had Iamblichus, and his school of thought was that, no, the soul is there, but also here. And so we need to use the material to cultivate a transcendent state. And in order to do that, you have to ask for help from the gods. Those, I guess, my perspective of what the quote unquote gods are is just aspects of the one, differentiated. It's like that famous Pink Floyd album cover for The Dark Side of the Moon. The white light is the one, the rainbow passing through the prism, those are the gods. And so we have to utilize certain things and ask for their intercession in order for us to reach these transcendent states. So sorcery, on the other hand, is not that. Now, those are my terms. Those are the terms that I'm defining my terms, right, before I start having this sort of conversation. But people that haven't really studied the origins of theurgy and have just seen it kind of tossed around out there, and even like a Golden Dawn context, they might disagree with me. And the same thing goes for sorcery. But again, I enjoy having terms because it clues me into the intent, right? Because there are people who do things for much more mundane reasons, and you call that whatever you want, gray magic, I call it sorcery, whatever it is. But that's a factual reality. And I think having terms for that so that we can discuss it is useful.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And I have, discussed this with a number of people and gotten their perspectives and their takes on it. And I'm not saying that one thing is wrong or one thing is right. I just think it is interesting and good to talk about those distinctions, because it kind of gives us a little bit of a deeper understanding into different aspects of things like magic. And I do enjoy learning about things like for Carlos Castaneda, for example, or different traditions, like different shamanic traditions. And I think that there's a lot of value that can be derived from those understandings in terms of things psychologically or things even physically or metaphysically. But Yeah, so I just thought that that was awesome, that, and I just think that's like a cool thing to talk about, and that's a really great kind of description that you gave in regards to your kind of thoughts about that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about
Yeah,
music.
I mean,
Or go ahead.
it's
Yeah.
I was just gonna agree with you. It's all useful. It's all useful. I mean, there's value in every section of these traditions, and I think you have to be I think you have to be pretty bold to talk about them and to bring them up and to foster discourse and discussion, and I think just having listened to some of your other podcast episodes, that's kind of why when you asked me if I wanted to come on, I just immediately was like, yes, absolutely, tell me when, because I knew that we could have a productive conversation.
Definitely. I agree. Yeah, it's funny too because when I went and listened to that like the bit you did on your magical episode, I swear it was almost like you're just tuning into so many of my thoughts. It's kind of one of those like synchronistic moments, but the way you're describing things was like that's exactly how I want to be able to convey what I'm thinking. And it so it was just really cool and funny. But on kind of like another note, I was listening to a podcast where you were discussing music and art with a guy, and it was really good, and it's really interesting. And I just made this connection. It was yesterday or the day before when I was listening to your recording with I think it was Jim Gennaro. You're talking about like music, and he said he was talking and he just said music really slowly. He's like music, and I was like, oh, and then in my head I was like, duh. I was like, the etymological origin of the word obviously comes from the muses, and it's funny because
Right.
I just recently did a episode on like the music of the spheres, and I still hadn't even like made that connection, but yeah, and then so I started thinking about like what is a musician, and then right after that he started talking about like the muses, and at one point he said something about almost, he said it like it almost feels as if it's like moving through him, not necessarily from him. um but when I think about this in terms of like some musicians or singers that I'm aware of recently in like modern times, there's a couple different ones that come to mind. There's this guy, and it's not necessarily my style of music, but I can acknowledge that it's really good. I think his name's Coulter Wall. He's kind of like a folk Western style dude. And I think he's like 28 or something. But when you hear him sing, you're like, how the hell is this voice coming out of that man? And there's kind of a less famous woman in Philadelphia, for another example. She goes by, I think her thing is like Zenadelphia. She's gonna eventually like explode for sure, but the same thing, the voice that comes out of her, it's like another being almost. And I don't even like, I didn't even at first believe that it was actually her. I was like, is this like, is she recording somebody else's voice and dubbing it over her? So I listened to multiple different ones or whatever, but yeah, it's almost like from a completely different like time or place. It seems like the voice that's some of these people are expressing. And so I want to ask you, like, what do you think about like music or the muses, and potentially maybe opening up a sort of channel for the muses to come through? Do you feel like these are like legitimate beings that are kind of coming through? Or yeah, I would love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good question. Uh right, so I've been a musician for, wow, I don't even want to say how long. But I think I started when I was 12. So I've been a
Wow.
musician for 24 years. Um and that's actually what I did for a living for a while. Um and I will say that I only understood what was going on. I guess I vaguely understood what was happening. I knew that I was tapping into something, especially like when I was in like my late 20s, 28, 29. And I just remember that my dream world and this record I was making with some friends of mine, they started to sort of mesh together. And it was a very interesting thing. But it wasn't until I really, really understood magic, astral magic, really, that that I really got what was happening. One of the big differences between magic as propounded in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, particularly by its earliest rendition, right? That I guess forming class, is that there was a lot of mysticism going on at the time. Spiritualism was huge, and Eastern forms of meditation were just coming over in waves to the West, really, England, or the UK and America. But there was a lot of trance mediumism, and there was also this tradition of what was called mesmerism, right? That's where we say, oh, I was mesmerized, which now we call hypnotism. It started out as mesmerism because it was this healing sort of practice that the was he a physician? I don't know if he actually had a physician's sort of background, but his name was Franz Anton Mesmer, and he developed this theory of quote unquote animal magnetism. And really, what he was doing, I guess, in modern vernacular, he was working with the etheric body to sort of remove blockages and stuff. It's Reiki. It's Reiki for French people in the 1700s. That was basically mesmerism, but a lot was from the standpoint of the early practitioners of the Golden Dawn. A lot of that was unsafe, right? You were opening yourself up, and once you're open in that, mesmerized, or what we would call trance hypnotic state, really anything can come in. And that's part of what the musician does, except the musician, like a really good musician, I think they are constantly channeling something, but they don't have to be in a trance state to do that. They oscillate in and out of these, I guess, attenuated states of reception and then expression, right? So it's like this circuit. I'm opening up to inspiration, and then I am becoming active, and I'm picking up my guitar, or I'm writing my lyrics. I'm not doing nothing. And in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, magicians do not practice trance mediumism. They do not practice what you call like modern, psychic reading and stuff like that, because we don't want to open up to just anything, right? Because I believe in the existence of, that external object of reality of otherwise disincarnate intelligences. They will use images to communicate. They will use, I guess, what you would call a person's available imagery in order so that some sort of commerce can happen. Now, is there any guarantee that what is coming through is showing you its true form? No, not necessarily. It can lead to all sorts of paranoid delusions and things like that. Again, you're also playing with psychology at a pretty deep level here. So that's something that magicians of the Golden Dawn stripe, we call our path active, whereas trance mediumism is passive. And I would say that music is a combination of both of those things for the musician. Now, I think to become really good at something, to achieve a level of fluency or proficiency, it has to become an extension of yourself. And a lot of things cannot be communicated in words. Words fail. These transcendental essences and experiences even that get to the core of who and what we are. And part of the problem of our modern denial of the existence of that thing is this obsession with words. Because as soon as you put something into words, you take something vital, alive, and you put it in a coffin just so that you can exchange it with somebody else. But you create this secondhand distance from the experience itself, which is all we're ever trying to do, is just get somebody to understand me, and and our experiences. And that's a huge motivating factor behind music, right? I mean, that is what the blues is. That is what soul is. I feel this. I want you to feel it too. And it's the tones, it's the scales they use. It's ineffable. You can't even quantify what's great about great music. You can try.
Oh my gosh, that was such a great description. And yeah, that's one of the reasons I love so much, just to listen to different forms of music that don't have words, just different, classical piano, Egyptian music, whatever. I just love when it's just the music and you can kind of just feel the state. I love that. All
Okay,
right.
one thing that I do want to mention, I know that I said that magicians don't open ourselves up to those other planes, but I want to do make a distinction here. We do, but the techniques that we use are those of hyper specificity, so that you're at a severe disadvantage when you can't physically objectively see the things you're trying to work with all the time. And so the techniques that we use are hyper specific, and that means that we do call things in and we do work with these sort of disincarnate powers, essences, whatever you want to call them. But it's basically like we are doing things to make sure we get what we call for, to the exclusion of everything else. So it's a very safe and specific way of doing it, which is why if anyone is listening who is familiar with the curriculum of the Golden Dawn, it's why it's so cumbersome and specific. I mean, essentially it's you get a PhD in the Western esoteric tradition of magic.
Yeah, that's actually a really good distinction to make for people, because I think there's probably kind of, I guess, what you'd call maybe more like sloppy forms of magic or things along those lines, and then more orderly and dialed in and precise. And I think that kind of is the difference between somebody that's kind of just coming at these things willy-nilly versus somebody that's following a structured, very intentional tradition. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And again, there's a perfect correlation to music. Like I was saying before, if you're to become really proficient at something, particularly music, your instrument has to become an extension of your body, or yourself, right? And so that's why an instrument can communicate things that you can't, because it's not using words. And I think it's the same. You look at somebody like Miles Davis, virtuoso, right? Once in a generation, maybe 2 or 3 generations. What most people don't know about Miles Davis is that he went to Juilliard. Sure, he probably scoffed at everything, but he went to Juilliard. Look, the man knew his stuff. It's not like he was pulling it completely out of his ass. It's just that you're seeing somebody who has made music such a part of themselves, who has found a way to speak his entire essence using a language that is 10 times broader than words, than verbal language. because of the time and attention and detail and knowledge. Everybody sees the finished product, but they don't see what the people did to get there. And a lot of times it's not the edgy shit, the nightclubs, and that's part of it. But it's a lot of it is also sitting down and being disciplined and knowing in and out, so that you finally get to a level where you don't need any of this shit anymore. I don't need the scales because they're a part of me. They're a part of me. I don't have to go back and look at the alphabet to sit here and talk to you, because I learned it, I studied it, I used it. I know the rules. I break them whenever I want because it's a part of me. And that's what magic can become if you submit yourself to a discipline rather than just like, oh, this, because at a certain point, especially like in the Golden Dawn, you're told it's like part of your grade work at a certain point. Okay, now go off and do this yourself. Make your own rituals. You do get to that point. It's just that we live in a time where people don't want to put the work in. It's like, I don't want to wait. I shouldn't have to wait. But it's like anything else, man. The more you put in, the more you're going to get out of it, and it will transcend. At first, it starts off as something that you do, and if you stay with it and you really make it an extension of yourself, it will become what you are, like music.
Yes. Yeah, a whole 100%. It's like the action aspect. I think a lot of people have a hard time coming to grips with, because there's obviously mental, like all things are mental, yes, and everything derives from mentality. Like, clearly that is a truth, but you have to have your thinking and your feeling and your willing, your action, all in alignment. And I feel that's kind of like the formula for what's going to actually manifest whatever it is that you're focusing your intention on. And people just want to kind of eliminate the action part, and that's part of it, and that's part of the fun too, and people should embrace it for sure.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely. And it's submitting yourself to that kind of trajectory and committing to any journey, committing to it, right? It can be one of the most intimate relationships you ever have with yourself.
that's a good way to put it, for sure. Yeah. Well, kind of sort of on the note of like the Western esoteric traditions and things along those lines, sort of shifting gears though, but like in regards to like spiritual alchemy, I heard you describe on a recent episode that you did the Solvayet coagula aspect of systems such as the Golden Dawn, and I really liked the way that you described it, and I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to that, and maybe share your thoughts on why someone may be interested in like some kind of practice that like this, and how it may be beneficial in terms of kind of like knowing thyself.
Yeah. Again, I guess that all comes down to intent. What's your intention? One of the things that I like to ask students of the Golden Dawn, particularly in my temple, is and I'm still human, so there's no shame in admitting that I kind of also enjoy watching them squirm when I ask this question. But my main question is always like, why are you here? What did you come here to do? What did you think was going to happen? And there's no right answer, right? There is no right answer. But it's not a question we ask ourselves. It's like we get this, we're inspired by something, but we don't, at least enough to take the action and take the step forward, but we're not always well acquainted with our why, quote unquote. And I think that your why is ultimately your most important part of your equation, right? Because when things suck, when things are hard, when things seem like, you know, it's just not going to work out. Because I mean, that's what success is. Success is somebody standing on top of a pile of failures. It's your why that is going to keep you going, so that you get through that sort of transitory period and accomplish something. So I think why, you know, big part of know thyself. And actually, it's funny because we were just talking about this, or I was just talking about this in my latest video that's coming up this Sunday. It's just basically like, you need to be acquainted with why you're doing this. You need to be honest with yourself. I think magic can do it, but life will also do it to you too. It will break you down. Right? Because the alchemical process is really, right. Alchemy is an analogy. It's a set of symbols that communicate something that pre-existed it. So we're not deriving our formula from alchemy. Alchemy is showing us that there is a formula in material reality, which takes something, breaks it down, and makes something new or stronger or better or more valuable, right? I mean, that's basically evolution in a nutshell. There's this great quote that I'll probably butcher from Marcus Aurelius, and to paraphrase, it says something like, nature loves nothing so much than to take old things, break them apart, and make new things with them. And it's a natural formula. So when we're talking about alchemy, at least in the spiritual sense, you know, it's just saying, like, you know, this process exists in everything. And what we're attempting to do is do it to ourselves. Now, in operative alchemy, you're exploring that with nature. You're actually attempting to go through this process with a natural substance, and then, you know, you take these things into yourself in hopes that the essence is distilled, or the process that it has gone through will have some kind of effect on you. And you had a great discussion. I forget the guy's name, forgive me, but you had a great discussion on this kind of stuff, and like astrological microdosing. It was fantastic. I love that episode and that
Taylor
term.
Ready.
It was very, very, very interesting. I really enjoyed his perspective. But basically, you know, I think life did it for me. I didn't choose this path specifically. I was much more into like comparative religions. I was much more into, you know, I studied Zazen and different kinds of Buddhism and Taoism, really. And then I kind of just had a series of meaningful coincidences, right? Synchronicities that led me to the door of Western esotericism. And I had no idea what it was. And part of this was also stemmed from a crisis in my life. Just a very, very, I had a really vicious Saturn return. My best friend died on my 30th birthday. And my life just kind of crumbled. And it was at that point, really, that the salve began for me, because I was living a life that was completely out of harmony with purpose and with who I was at my core. I had let the vain pursuits of, you know, egotistical motivations taint my musical work and my creative work and a lot of my spiritual ideas and practices. And that's, you know, that's something to be very aware of, right? A lot of people go many years without realizing that a lot of their spiritual work ultimately culminates with them handing something that could have been good. They just hand it off to another ego. It's like, well, you know, now I I wear a caftan, I have a pencil thin mustache, and I'm this kind of persona when a lot of, in my experience, that Salve et Coagula thing is really about breaking down the artifice of who you have designed yourself to be, to get back in touch with who you really are. And I think that's really important. I think it's what a lot of us want secretly deep down. I think that's that itch, that knock, that's just calling, and we look for it in a lot of different places, but very rarely do we want to seek out painful experiences. And typically it has been like, most people that come to the Golden Dawn have, like, I would say it's about 60-40%. That's roughly, in my experience, new initiates to the Golden Dawn have either just experienced a trauma, some sort of crisis where their life kind of breaks apart. I guess the best symbol I could use for that is the tarot card, is the Tower card, tarot. And they're just ripe for that experience. They're ready for the Salve and the Coagula. I can't speak necessarily as to why other people would want to go through that, but I will say that I think that is right. A lot of people say, there are many roads up the mountain. Well, I think there's a point where they all join, even if they separate again after that. And I think that point where all those roads join, that central causeway, is in some way that Salve et Coagula, the breaking down of who you thought you were creating yourself to be, and living in a state of unawareness, avidya, error. And it doesn't have to happen through ritual initiation. It can happen, like, life will do it to you. Life will humble you. And it's from there that you can put yourself kind of back together, or who knows, you can go off the rails. Not everybody has a happy ending.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's some of the things you said, it's sad to hear in a way, but in other ways, it's guys like you that know or recognize these truths to such a deep extent. And that's kind of what adds a lot of value in terms of how you communicate these things, because you're able to actually really relate to the depths of them, and kind of display your experience in terms of like your kind of overall transmutation, in terms of like a spiritual kind of transmutation. And kind of additionally, bouncing back, I totally agree, like when you were talking about like the who, what, when, where, but we have the why, and that's 100%, like that's like the connection point between the internal and the external, because the who, what, when, where, that's all external. The why, that's what brings it in tune and in contact with your individual self, and your individual self in relation with the external. So I just want to, I think that was such a good point that you made. And yeah, I think there's very few like paths out there that are deeply effective paths in terms of like alchemizing these sort of shadow recognitions and transmutations, if you will. And so I think that it's really cool when you kind of elaborate like that and speak to how your experience with systems like the Golden Dawn kind of brought you in contact with these sort of recognitions, and kind of helped reconcile those things in terms of your psyche. I think that's exactly the point, and that's the thing that is so important to be communicated with anybody who's interested in these things, because that's the gold right there, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, that's the thing. And it doesn't necessarily make you a very well-liked person all the time, but that's not, I I took I take all of this stuff up with a measure of reluctance, because typically it's the people who want to do it the most that probably shouldn't be the ones behind the stick. In certain cases, right? Because the internal thing, it has to come from a place that transcends like what you want in this moment. Otherwise, when it gets hard, you're not going to be able to keep going, and a lot of spiritual stuff, when you really begin to engage with spiritual currents, now, whether that's a mainstream religion or whether it's fringe spirituality, it's going to challenge you. It should be. And if your why is not strong enough, if it was all aesthetic, if it was just escapism, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things, right? Because I say this a lot. It's some of the worst things about our personalities that bring us. Those are the things that take the first step on the road to changing our life for the better. I mean, it's the lesser parts of us that can begin the process that ends up being the best thing we ever did with our lives. So, right, everything has a purpose, everything has validity, but you have to vet your why, and you have to learn patience. I think there are a couple spiritual lessons that everybody's got to learn, whether that's yoga, whatever it is, chaos magic. You need to learn. Spirit will teach you patience. One of the things when new aspirants come and we say, okay, you want to be a part of the Golden Dawn, you want to join the temple, are you reading anything about the Golden Dawn? And a lot of people will say, I'm reading, the Black Book, the Black Brick, Israel Regardie's 6th edition, the Golden Dawn. And we tell them, okay, stop reading any of that stuff. Because you're about to learn the curriculum from, a practical standpoint. And, I know how they feel, where it's like, they want to do this thing, and this is the book, right? This is supposedly where everything is contained. And there's a lot, there's two parts to the Golden Dawn. There's the outer order and the inner order. So the outer order stuff is in there. But my consolation to them is that, yeah, somebody may be able to come up to you, right? This kind of like internet magician doesn't, you've never even met the person before. You're not sure that they're not a troll, but they can come up to you and say, yeah, I read the Black Book. I read it twice. Well, in time, you'll be able to say, I lived it. I don't, I don't need to read if I am living this experience. Right? Isn't that the point? It seems to me this is one of the biggest impetuses for me to start this YouTube channel and podcast, is that everybody's constantly obsessed with the book learning. And I think that a lot of people are interested in these topics because they feel called to a spiritual quest. And they're digging, right? We're all digging for I guess in Masonry you would call it, further light, and whatever it is. But we're all seeking, we're all trying to find our own answers. And a lot of times now I see people mistaking, people behave as if the books are the dirt. I'm digging in the dirt. I'm digging through these books. The books are the shovel. The books are not the dirt. Your life is the dirt. The books are the tools you use to do the digging, not the digging. It's not the materia itself, So we've kind of put the cart before the horse.
Absolutely. It's funny. I myself have been kind of experiencing this exact recognition lately. I mean, a large part of my podcast revolves around my interest in these subjects and inquiring and trying to learn more and, kind of feeling everything out. And I'm feeling this kind of time for application and more involved experience. And so I agree with that. And kind of bouncing back to what you were saying, like the lesser parts of us ourselves and these like shadow aspects, those are kind of like the greater signals that can be hinting at things, and we just need to be aware of those and pay attention, because those are pointing us into the direction that we might need to pay attention. And exactly like you said, like patience, like don't forget, patience is a virtue, and like that's such an important virtue
Right.
too. And it's like one of those kind of like cheesy things, like
Yeah.
patience is a virtue, but it's so true. And it's like I I kind of I always try to observe that recognition in my own personal life, and I think that it does bring tremendous value, and it's something that's not necessarily always the easiest thing, but it is effective, and it serves its great purpose. And I have to ask, this is kind of like a
Yeah.
side note, but those images behind you,
Sure.
you've got one,
Hmm.
I think it's on your right, and then one on your left. I believe the one on your left is some kind of Kabbalistic image. I've only seen that in one other place. I'm really curious about that. I wonder if you can kind of speak to, I feel like that's a significant image back there, and what that depicts.
Yeah. That is the Kabbalistic tree of life. It's essentially a glyph. It's a pictorial symbol um, that encapsulates or symbolizes all the constituent essences of everything in the world and everything that transcends the physical world. Um, uh, when you really understand it, you can study this for many, 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 many years before you really unlock any level of insight of any depth. But when you understand it, it becomes the key to everything. It's the principal foundation upon which much of modern Western magic is based on. I would say the philosophies of Neoplatonism, the philosophies of Hermeticism, and the Kabbalah are the three foundational. They're the cornerstone of the Western esoteric tradition as it is practiced today. And so it's basically just lines and circles. It doesn't, it's not the most complex spiritual diagram, but I mean everything that exists can be put in one or another of those little circular filing cabinets over there. And along with the tree of life, the Hebrew alphabet is another symbol set of the Kabbalah. So it's really principally those two things, right? This symbol system in diagrammatic form, and then the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which is a whole symbol, I guess, system in and of itself. But this particular version, I forget the gentleman who did the art, but I absolutely love it. He synthesized so much other stuff. He uses Taoist keywords and keywords from Sanatana Dharma and geometric glyphs like the pentagram and the hexagram. And he it's a very syncretic version. That's why I really liked it. It helped me when I was meditating on the tree of life to really kind of bridge these gaps between systems. It's all there. It's all in that diagram. Everything fits. But I would say so that's really the image that caught my eye, that got me started to read that book, The Oracle of Kabbalah by Rabbi Richard Seidman.
Mm.
I saw the tree of life in that book, and I was like, oh my, this, I don't know what this is, but it's important.
Okay, and then how about the one to your right? It looks like some kind of color spectrum of some sort. What is the significance of that one
Yeah.
for you?
So that's the basically just the common color wheel. I believe it's before like Munsell hue system.
Hmm.
I think that one was more around when color theory was just being like pioneered in the 1700s. Color plays an extremely important part, particularly in the the magic of the inner order of the Golden Dawn. And one of the reasons is all the symbols we use are representative of certain forces or powers. But color is a force in and of itself, right? We know that. We know that, there is a frequency, there is a spectrum that is radiant, at least enough for us to be able to perceive it. So color is a huge part of the modern Western esoteric tradition. I believe even penetrated into like modern paganism kind of fusiony stuff through Raymond Buckland,
Mm.
right? He used to write um a lot about a lot of these things, and he's got this really great short book called Buckland's Color Magic.
Wow.
So, but again, these things came from the Golden Dawn. They came from this like maybe 10 or 12 people in the 1880s that were doing this stuff. And so these two things are very, very important to the system.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. The things that kind of come to mind, it just made me kind of reflect on some episodes that I've done with some of my guests, and that Tom Joseph Brown in particular, he was describing, I think it was a guy named Dinshaw. I always forget his last, Dinshaw Gadiali or something like that. But he had like some kind of system of color healing, and then there was also this aspect of Goethe and Goethe's color theory. And I don't really necessarily remember all the details of it or anything like that, but I agree 100% that color in and of itself is definitely very magical, I would say, and definitely has its
Yeah, I mean,
uses.
it, you the thing is, like you say, like color healing, and most people roll their eyes, but I mean it's a modern medical practice to put people who are jaundiced under blue light. When I was jaundiced when I was born, and I ended up recovering being under blue light, which is, so
Wow.
it's like even the modern scientific community embraces aspects of color healing. It's legit.
Definitely. And then you got like a lot of people are kind of coming to the understanding of even similar things like the morning rising of the sun, and then the setting of the sun in terms of the infrared rays that it puts out, and how those, if you kind of don't necessarily stare directly at the sun, but there's a technique for sun gazing where you kind of allow some of those wavelengths to be received into your eyes, and those effects on your mitochondria, and how important and imperative they are in terms of being able to kind of regulate systems inside of your biology and stuff. And then you got like modern devices, like there's a lot of yeah, like teeth whitening technologies with like the blue lights. And yeah, I totally color, I mean, you can't ignore the science behind color. That's it, absolutely is an essential truth.
Yeah, because it's not a symbol, it's a force in and of itself,
Yeah.
like which is what is taught in the inner order of the Golden Dawn. And it's pretty incredible once you start. I remember, I mean, even just becoming aware of color, right? Color today is something that we take for granted, whereas if you can kind of picture a time or place where maybe let's say Victorian England wasn't so colorful, right? Maybe like to see somebody walking down the streets in a neon green shirt would have been like freaked people out, we're exposed to all these colors on a daily basis, in ads and just things that are constantly trying to get our attention. But when you start to really intentionally pay attention to certain colors, certain groupings of colors, a lot of what we do has to do with complementary colors. So that's taking colors that are on the opposing ends of the color wheel and using them together. And this creates what's called, like flashing colors. They have this, you can see it really well. If you take something that's green, maybe like, let's say like an astrological symbol or like a planetary symbol. Let's take like Mars, for example. If you take the symbol for Mars in green and put it against a red background, there's something so strange that happens with your eyesight. And the only thing that we can call it is like a flash, because we don't really know what's going on. But so it's stuff like that where we can play around with these things. And again, right, it's all an experiment in consciousness.
Yes, and I love it, just the idea of complementary opposites. It's so important because we think of opposites as like, almost, a lot of people might see these things as like clashing, or like in some kind of conflict with each other. But complementary opposites, like these things, they're opposites, yet
Right.
they work together so well. They're like two sides of the same coin. And like you mentioned red and green, and I think that's such a great one too, because in terms of like, you think of like Christmas that's just formerly passed, and those are like the primary colors of Christmas is red and green contrast. And
Yeah.
there's definitely something truly magical about that combination, and it definitely instills some kind of conscious awareness that I don't even know really how to describe. But I totally agree with you that that definitely is like a there's something there for sure. um
Yeah.
Kind of I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, but on a side note, I wanted to ask you, because I think I'd heard you mention in one of your conversations, I think one of your inspirations perhaps was Dion Fortune, and you had mentioned Dion Fortune earlier in our conversation, and I wanted to see if maybe you can just elaborate a little bit about Dion Fortune. I don't know a whole lot, but it's a name that kind of keeps popping up, I guess, for me. And so, yeah, anything interesting or insightful about Dion Fortune? Maybe you can give a little bit of insight.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So uh I guess what's important to first state is that when the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn of I guess the original class, when they split in the early 1900s, one of the founders and his wife, who were both very, very active in creating sort of the quote unquote magical curriculum of the Golden Dawn, they moved to Paris and they started something called the Alpha et Omega. And essentially they were like, okay, we're taking our curriculum and we're giving it a different name, going to tweak the rituals slightly, but this is where the true Golden Dawn is. So it operated for quite a while. And I believe Dion Fortune was initiated into that, the Alpha and Omega, again in the early 1900s. I'm pretty sure the story is that she really butted heads with Moyna Mathers, who was Sam Mathers, again one of the founders. That was his wife, who she, after his death in I think 1918 from Spanish influenza, she took over in his stead, kind of, keeping the order alive. So they butted heads, and Dion Fortune was actually expelled. And I believe she went to the the Bristol Temple in the UK of what was then the English line of succession of the Golden Dawn, where she worked with Israel Regardie. So there's somebody who, again, was a classically trained magician, what I would consider a student of Theurgy, coming through that system of the Golden Dawn. She was also very psychic. There's a book, it's her writings. I believe she was very young. It's channeled material, and it's the Cosmic Doctrine. That's what it's called. And that's more of like her sort of channeled psychic work. So she was a prolific writer. The issue was that you had her and Crowley at the same time, kind of in the same communal discourse. Right. They were talking about the same things to very similar groups of people in what was, the common media of that time was books, they would publish. And where it gets really hairy. I'm continually surprised at how many people are like huge Crowley fans and Thelemites and all this stuff, and they belong to the OTO. And so I don't want to isolate or offend anybody, but I'm much more of a Dion Fortune. Right. I'm much more of a Dion Fortune person. And they were both talking about the same things, this kind of circuit of force, this magical force that was psycho-spiritual, psychosexual in nature. If you look at really any sexual impulse, is when you boil it down to what it is a creative impulse, right? Because that is the function biologically of sex, not fun, creation. It happens to be that we happen to enjoy it very much as an impetus to keep going. Let's keep doing this. Let's keep this crazy train on on the tracks and making more people. But whereas Crowley kind of espoused this very, Mark Stavish puts it in a really good, it has an amazing way of he calls it therapeutic blasphemy. So whereas Crowley takes this kind of like therapeutic blasphemy, this really hard rebellious line against kind of the quote unquote oppressive paradigm of his time, and he tells people to kind of explore these things, and he's very, very counterculture. You have Dion Fortune on the other hand saying like, what we should get rid of is we should get rid of the stigma around sex without becoming obsessed with it. Because these are powers. These are right. She didn't believe in the whole Victorian stigma behind it. She thought we didn't understand. We completely isolate ourselves as a species from this basic creative impulse that we have. So she took a much more middle path, like you're saying, the complementary of opposites. That's how you get to the middle path, not by oscillating back and forth. Crowley had it mixed up. He said, okay, if you're one way and you come to me, I'm going to send you in the opposite direction. If you're somebody who's very kind of shy and prude and is into book learning, I'm going to tell you to go out and get drunk and get laid and just go crazy.
One extreme to the other.
And that's exactly it. That's not how you find the middle way, friends. It's not how you do it. You have to transcend having to go to extremes. You don't, otherwise you're still on the pendulum. You're never going to stop swinging until you realize like, oh, I just need to get off. I need to step off of this. And that's kind of much more the way Dion Fortune kind of proposed it, and another great quote of hers is that I really enjoy when you're attempting to contextualize what magic is. And when you start using these forces, she says, there's no such thing as evil. Evil is that's what we call misplaced force. And the purpose it serves is that it's a thrusting block towards the good, right? It's kind of, I think I mentioned this in one of my podcast discussions. I mean, like a human being, in order for you to swim towards the surface, you have to start drowning. And I think that was kind of her way of explaining this idea of why or how good and bad existed, from our vantage points in materiality. But she also started the fraternity or society of Inner Light in Glastonbury in the UK. Right, Glastonbury is famously where that ancient the ruins of the ancient abbey were, and it's fabled to be formerly the island of Avalon, where King Arthur died, and his remains are buried there. All that fun kind of British myth. So she moved there and she started her own society, her own fraternity there, and a lot of the work she did, like Gareth Knight came out of that. Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki kind of was attached to that school. I think it produced guys like A.E. Butler, and even Raymond Buckland, like we were talking about. So she started this kind of much more psychic approach to magical work. It was a very harmonious union of that intellectual, very hyper specific magical path, but then also brought in that much more feminine current of, being in touch with the spiritual realities through the lens of emotion and psychism to some degree. So I really enjoy that because, as a man, I know that I come across as very like, I know a lot of history and my mind's going a mile a minute, but in reality, I'm much more in touch with the kind of creative, dreamy, archetypal side of myself. That's really who I am in the interior. So I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed that she was a counterforce to somebody like Crowley, who was all about just disguising decadence as some kind of sophistication or enlightenment.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like Glastonbury. I feel like I interviewed a guy named Benjamin Terrell of the Temple of Mercury, and I think he was telling me about some alchemist from Glastonbury. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Sir Dunstan or something along those lines. So that kind of struck my mind when you were talking about that. I may have that confused. I think he was from Glastonbury though. But another thing you were kind of touching on, it's funny, in a conversation with I had with a friend of mine, Birch Driver, we were kind of talking about the Kabbalion, and the gist I took away from it was kind of like, ride the fulcrum. Like, don't become polarized to necessarily one side or the other of anything, but like kind of the goal is like you want to like ride that middle ground, like you said, like the middle path. And so yeah, I love it. And I'm totally on board with all the things you were saying about, like, you're talking about like the sexual energies, and I think that's something that you touched on in one of your recent uh Taoist alchemy episodes. So people will have to check that one out too. So anyway, I got a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you about,
Yeah,
and this,
man, this is a lot of fun. I'm I'm really enjoying this. I really yeah.
yeah, me too. I wanted to ask you about esoteric Christianity and what that means to you, and if someone, another situation, like if someone came up to you and was like, what is esoteric Christianity? Because that's a foreign concept. How would you even go about trying to describe that to somebody?
Um I don't know, because this may be the first time that somebody has ever asked me what esoteric Christianity is. Uh but let's try it. Let's let's see if I could answer this question. Um so there's obviously um many different sects of Christianity. There's a whole bunch, right? There's the Anglican Church, the various branches of Protestantism. There's the Catholic, there's the large O Orthodox, lots of, and then it just gets into all sorts of hairy places with, charismatics, Pentecostals, and things like that. And look, I respect all religious beliefs. I sincerely do. But they rely too much for me, on the interpretation that quote unquote church fathers and doctors of the church have. Now, if you want to talk about it becomes difficult for me to, I'll put it this way. I really appreciate Christianity, but I don't really care about churchianity. And a lot of people that are involved in the church say, well, the church is inseparable. You only get Christianity through the church. And I don't believe that that's true. I don't necessarily subscribe to one group of core canonical gospels or textual interpretations of this kind of Christ event or Christ consciousness sort of coming into the world. And I don't, and this is where my heresy is. I don't care whether or not Christ was real. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't have it just doesn't matter. I believe in the message. I believe that power exists, that essence, that Christic force, that is initiatory and is the heart of the universe. So if Christ was fully man and fully God, that's pretty awesome. And if this is all just a potent analogy for a spiritual blueprint for how to become self-actualized and spiritually potent, then that's just as great too, right? And esoteric Christianity, I think it's not really that. It got kind of screwed up with the whole Dan Brown thing, where people think it's like we're looking for Jesus's family or something like that. It's it's much more taking the idea or the model of Christ and applying that in your own behavior, and saying that, well, there are aspects of this Christic theology here that I can experience, rather than just having to go to church and do this rote formula for, and somebody kind of pats me on the head and says, okay, Jesus loves you now. There are, I guess, teetering on the verge of using the word gnosis, really, an actual experiential knowledge of things like the Holy Spirit, of things like the saints of the church, and of things like transubstantiation, right? This alchemical sort of operation where we're turning something, it's of one substance with God and with Christ. And in the same way that an alchemist, right, prays to God as opposed to a chemist, he prays for the intercession of the divine in his work, and then in the end is producing this spagyric, this quintessence, which he takes into his body. It's the same thing with the Eucharist. It's just that, in different denominations, they just say only our priests can do this. It's only accomplished through these select few who follow all our rules. And I'm not sure that that's what esoteric Christianity is to other people, but for me, it's about taking because we can go really, really deep. I mean, this goes into Neoplatonism. I mean, this, it goes back to Plato, everything does. But in the 10th book of the Republic, he has this tale that he relates, and it's called the myth of Now, I did a whole episode on Plato, but I left this out because it has to be its own episode. That's how important it is. But it's called the Myth of and essentially he's retelling a tale of this near-death experience that this man named had, where he transcended his physical body and got a glimpse through the curtain to the other side. And Plato retells this whole story about how you're just this kind of undifferentiated soul in this realm outside of the eighth sphere, the Ogdoad, the fixed sphere of the stars. And you are brought down, you reincarnate, right? I think they called it metempsychosis. You reincarnate, you transmigrate from one realm to the other, and you're led by what they call the daimon. And that word was eventually changed into the word demon, but essentially, this agatho daimon was the guide of good counsel. It was your spiritual guide, took your soul by the hand, or whatever, whatever part of your anatomy that your soul has, and pulled you down into the earth, into the physical body. And as you passed through these spheres, as you passed through the heavenly spheres, the Jupiterian sphere, the Saturnian sphere, the Mercurial sphere, your psyche, right? Psyche meant soul in Greek. Your psyche, your psyche absorbed the characteristics of these spheres. So your communicative would be intellectual, clever side. That would be the positive sides of the mercurial sphere. If you're a liar, if you're a thief, if you're a cheater, if you're very covetous, those are the negative aspects of that sphere. So the diamond pulls you down, plants you in your body, and on the way down, you absorb these different, I guess to use an analogy, you absorb the colors of the spheres, and that plants you there. So now, in early Christianity, right? Because there was no one universal form of Christianity. In the beginning, it was all these different schools of thought competing for space with each other, one of them being the Gnostics. So at that time, right, you have guys like early church father, even to the Catholics, Origen, early church father, Tertullian, Pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite. You have all these early church fathers, these people who influenced the church as it stands today. And they were all Neoplatonists. They were all taught by Neoplatonist teachers. I mean, Origen, I believe, was a student of Ammonius Saccas, which is he taught Plotinus, the first Neoplatonist. Like, these people got all their philosophy from the same teachers. And this kind of conception of the spheres, the archons, it was all implanted in early Christianity. It was a given. It was the philosophical paradigm that they operated in, and it was the water they swam in. So we go back to some of these ideas, right? The idea of Sophia, wisdom, descending from on high down into the material sphere, and essentially being tormented or in some very, very drastic verbiage, raped here, and realizing that she had made a mistake coming here, perhaps being an analogy for the soul. And she calls out for help. I'm caught here. I'm tormented. These are my captors. And it's the Christ force that answers her and comes down. It's the hand that can only come down to grab you and pull you out when you sincerely ask for help. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, about life being the initiator. You have that tower card experience, that salve, alchemical salve, where you are just torn apart, and something inside of you, your soul or your heart, just says, like, help. And it's only in that fire, in that distress, that it's sincere enough that the help actually comes. And so that's what the idea of this salvific Christic force is in esoteric or forms of esoteric Christianity. And that's that's just a kind of a small piece of it. I mean, it's a very, we could talk about this for like 4 hours itself.
Damn, dude. I love your mind and your ability to articulate these things. It's seriously, it's so refreshing, and I love that you brought up the Sophia aspect of things, because people often kind of don't really get in touch with that. And you touched on the Christ aspect, and see, you actually, in my opinion, you're in touch with the actual essence of the message versus the dogma. And when you talk about things like Neoplatonism, it's such a gigantic underexplored aspect of
Yeah.
thought in terms of history that people, well, very little people get in touch with. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of people out there that touch on Neoplatonism, but people that actually really dive into it and understand it, and like you said, you've read like Iamblichus and Plotinus and these figures, and you have a real sense of where their minds were at and what they were trying to convey. And you mentioned like the Agatha diamond, and that's something that was previously mentioned to me at one point, and I really didn't quite understand it until recently. And I just love so much of what you just said right there. So that was a great way of describing things. And I liked, you said Christianity versus churchianity. I was like, that's the best way to put it. I
Right.
couldn't have said it better. But yeah.
You know, you know what actually, actually, I'm not 100% sure, but for some reason I think I stole that line from Dion Fortune, believe it or not.
Okay.
That's why she's great.
She is definitely, from what I understand. I've got to read her now that I'm becoming aware of all this. But all right, man. Well, I want to ask you maybe if just a few more things. Like, what are some of your current
Sure.
goals, or some of the things that you just hope to achieve with your overall work, maybe with your podcast? Or what are some things that yeah, what are you hoping to achieve with all of this? And what are some important, maybe last messages that you want to leave people on?
Well, I want to start a mega church and televangelize. No, I'm totally kidding. I don't know. I don't know. I will say this. I have undertaken this at the behest of what I consider to be something bigger than me. Uh and I do it with a certain amount of reluctance and a certain amount of respect for people, that are out there and want to learn, and even people that have a differing opinion than me, right? I'm not going to coddle you, and I'm not going to back down, but we can have an open discussion, and I that's why I like conversations, because I learn something every time too, and I guess discourse, I'd like a little bit more of a practitioner community, and not being at odds or feeling like we're alone or feeling like we have to hide the things that we're interested in. And those are some good things that I think can come from this kind of work, not just by me, but by other people as well. And I would just say that I hope to accomplish whatever it is that whatever is calling me to do this wants to have happen. And I hope that there's some good in that. So and that's
Definitely.
about it.
Yeah.
I hope I just keep going. It's I mean, I'm sure like it's a labor of love, man. It's hard work.
Especially in these territories that we're getting into. And I feel like I always say this, but this has been one of the most enjoyable interviews and podcast discussions that I've had. I would just like to say you're the man. Where can people find out more about you and yourself and your work, and yeah, just anything that you want to put out there? Go ahead.
Um First I want to say I really enjoyed this too, and I would love to have you come and be on my podcast as well, because
Definitely.
you got to learn a little bit about me tonight and stuff, and I would love to be put in the position where I'm learning from you as well. I'd like to hear your perspectives and know more about what it is that you're interested in and the kind of things that you're pursuing. So anytime you want, please, it's just on the table. But so the Arcanum is the name of the project, and it's divided into two portions. It's Arcanum, which is just episodic lectures comprised of theory, history, and the very sorely missing topic of practice. I am going to actually give practitioner instructional videos. One of them premieres this Sunday. I'm not sure when this podcast will be out, but it's just for anybody who wants to watch it. It's called Getting Started with Ritual. And that's just on my YouTube channel, which is Arcanum. And then also I will typically release those videos on Sundays, and then on Wednesdays I'll release a podcast episode, which is an audio only sort of conversation with practitioners in the esoteric community, similar to this. So those for right now are both on the YouTube channel. You can search Arcanum, or I think they're giving you like handles now, right, on YouTube. So mine, I think, is youtube.com/@Arcanum. But the important thing, I guess, is that I I guess I typeset it as like a V instead of a U.
Yes.
So it's ARCANVM.
And that's
so
isn't that the original Latin?
So that's really it. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is awesome.
That's exactly what it is.
Ike Baker.
Yeah.
You're the man. I appreciate this greatly. I just want to say again, thank you so much. Seriously, I highly recommend that everybody go check out his channel. Yes, thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Absolutely.